Hi everyone, I'm here today to tell you more about the paper Prevalence and Salience of Problematic Microtransactions in Top Grossing Mobile and PC Games, a content analysis of user reviews. I'm Elena Petrovskaya, the first author of the paper, and this work was carried out with my colleagues and supervisors Sebastian Deterding and David Zendle. At the time of the work being carried out, we were all affiliated with the University of York and the Intelligent Games and Games Intelligence Doctoral Training Center. So before I tell you more about the work, I should give an overview of what are microtransactions. So chances are you've heard the word used a lot in media. Microtransactions can encompass anything from in-game currency to loot boxes to wait timers in mobile games. Broadly, they are uncapped, repeated in-game purchases, which are quite often seen in what is known as a freemium model, where the game is available for free upfront, but the revenue is then generated from player purchases within the game. And chances also are that if you've heard the word microtransactions, you've heard it in quite a negative way. The broad reason for this is that as the revenue generation shifts from upfront payment to in-game payment, companies have more incentive to sort of tap into user needs and increase things like player time on device and player spending, moving from free play to paid play. And there are some concerns that this might be done in potentially unethical ways, including manipulation, deception, coercion of players. And there is also concern that this is all contributing to a broad gamification of games. And given that gambling already has some known associated harms, there is a chance that games might also come with such harms, which is why microtransactions are being heavily investigated and in some cases regulated. However, current research into microtransactions firstly largely consists of researcher-centric work, so things like pattern analysis and taxonomization based on researcher-generated frameworks and ethical discussions of microtransactions, as well as some focus on player harm, but this directly comes from largely loot boxes. And in fact, regulatory attention has also prioritized studying loot boxes because of their already established links to problem gambling. Obviously, this is all very important research, but we also need to understand more about other potentially problematic microtransactions, of which there are many. And one of the steps in doing so is to understand how prevalent they are, as this can aid sort of seeing the extent of potential problems, and also to look at the player perspective. So which of these problematic microtransactions are the most negatively salient to players? In our work, we took the 50 highest grossing mobile games from the Google Play Store and 50 highest grossing desktop games from Steam. We scraped the most recent 50 negative player reviews for these games. And after cleaning the data, we ended up with 692 mobile game reviews and 141 desktop game reviews. We proceeded to analyze these using content analysis based on our previous work, which was a taxonomy of predatory monetization techniques generated based on player perspectives. For each microtransaction or problematic technique, we assigned a prevalence score, which was the number of games within a platform, mobile or desktop, that contain this technique, and salience, which was the relative share of negative reviews per technique, calculated in a slightly more complicated way, which I won't go into here, but you can read about it in detail in the paper. So the core findings were 44 out of 50 mobile games and 14 out of 50 desktop games contained at least one problematic microtransaction, and the average number of techniques per game was 2 for desktop games and 3 for mobile games. So we're already seeing that mobile games contain or are perceived to contain more problematic microtransactions. To go into it in more depth, mobile games are also seen as more so having been designed to drive spending. So that technique refers to what players perceive to the whole game environment has sort of been designed to get them to spend money rather than for their enjoyment of the game. And over half of mobile games were seen as such. And the most salient, the most noticeable to players was when products were presented in an unrealistic way. So whether that's through deceit or tactical highlighting of certain features. And to name and shame, the most problematic game was Marvel Strike Force with 9 techniques. Desktop games, the situation is a bit milder. So the most prevalent and the most salient are the same. And essentially that refers to core parts of game which players believe are integral to the gameplay experience being locked behind a paywall. And the most problematic game only contains 4 techniques. So we're seeing far fewer problematic techniques in desktop than mobile games. However, the situation might not be that simple. So mobile games might just be more so perceived as being manipulated to drive player spend than desktop games. But this could also be because of existing biases and norms around mobile games. There's sort of a documented discrepancy between people who play desktop games and their opinions on mobile games, which sort of taps into genders as well. So men have traditionally gravitated towards desktop games, and perhaps when they voice their opinions, they perceive mobile games more negatively. And that's not necessarily representative of what people who might play mobile games but not actually voice their opinions feel. It's also interesting that the most salient techniques don't feature gamification related issues, but rather focus on things like fairness and honesty as being important to players as elements of game design. It's also important to think about, why do the highest grossing games feature so many problematic microtransactions? Is it because players are being trapped into spending money? Is the spend largely coming from a small proportion of players who can afford it? And it's impossible to tell as well as contextual data, but it's a really important question to ask. To acknowledge some limitations of our work, as I've already mentioned, negative reviews might be biased and might only represent certain communities which would feel comfortable enough to leave their reviews. And we also did not consider the full ecosystem. So perhaps if we looked at indie game development platforms, it might have been a different picture, as indie games sort of aspire to sometimes different morals of game development. I'd like to leave you with what are emerging to be sort of core values for monetization design in video games based on our work with players. And this is transparency, equality for game experience for all players, payment or no payment, and value for money. So if a player spends money, they expect to have a product in return that is worth that money. And a question to think about: what is the relationship between play and revenue generation? Why do the highest grossing games contain problematic microtransactions? Is play now just becoming convergent with payment? Should we reevaluate what our definitions of play are? Is it silly to consider that we still might have a magic circle that's completely shielded from economic concerns in light of technological development? Thank you very much for listening, and let me know if you have any questions. I can be contacted through those links.